During the First World War, the conflict was fought mostly in trenches, and it was a war of attrition. This meant that different armies sought to grind their enemies down, and the trench environment became a horrific place of terror. They were often poorly built, and they also became dumps of rubbish, but also in places, trenches flooded, and there would be vermin such as rats regularly found feasting on whatever they could. The trenches were enough to make anyone lose their minds, and there was constant artillery fire going off around the soldiers, and no one had any sleep, but in some areas the trenches were so close to the enemy that a soldier with a well-placed grenade could cause terror in the enemy trench. But because of the environment, there were a number of medical conditions that the soldiers got, such as trench foot, which was caused by flooding around the dugouts. But one common psychological condition that soldiers during the First World War suffered from was a type of PTSD which became known as shell shock. Welcome to the Fortress. Today we look at the terror of shell shock, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the First World War, the British Army experienced reports from their soldiers that they were suffering from the effects of combat. This included a number of symptoms such as the shakes or tremors, as well as dizziness, headaches, sensitivity to noise and others. But in more serious cases, there were prisoners who were reported to be exhibiting a sort of behaviour that one would expect to see if someone had a serious brain injury. There were up to 10% of soldiers who were suffering from what was deemed nervous or mental shock. From this term, shell shock was used to describe the condition, and it was linked to the effect that soldiers were experiencing from the sound and horror of artillery shells exploding all around them. The word was first published in the Lancer in 1915, and it was also claimed that a high percentage of shell shock sufferers had issues with their nerves, and some even displayed other problems, such as becoming mute, and some became aimless wanderers who walked dangerously around the trenches. However, the issue with the condition was that it was not very well understood, and many members of the armed forces believed that these conditions were linked to desertion and later military offences such as cowardice, and some officers believed it was a sign of weakness, as it was an excuse for soldiers to then leave the battlefield. Doctors believed otherwise, and some considered that the environment of the trenches had caused hidden damage to the brain, or a cerebral lesion that caused these problems, and other physicians claimed that gases such as carbon monoxide from the explosions could have caused the condition and the breakdown. Some of the men who exhibited symptoms had not been near shells when they exploded, but the evidence of the condition continued to split the opinions of the officers within the British Army. It was claimed that shell shock and shell concussion cases should have the letter W prefixed to the report of the casualty, if it was due to the enemy, in the case that the patient would be entitled to rank as wounded and to wear on his arm a wounded stripe. If, however, the man's breakdown did not follow a shell explosion, it was not thought to be due to the enemy, and he was to be labelled shell shock S for sickness, and was not entitled to a wound stripe or a pension. So someone who experienced shell shock, which was not linked to an explosion or the actions of the enemy, was said to have been banned from collecting a pension. But to begin with, those soldiers who suffered from the condition would be evacuated quickly from the front line, as they were considered dangerous to morale, and it was also deemed that they were unpredictable, and the officers did not want their sort of behaviour to catch on. There was a growing number of cases, and during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, it was claimed that 40% of the soldiers who were wounded were shell-shocked, and there was a number of soldiers suffering with not physical wounds but mental ones, and this was becoming a more serious problem. Some soldiers were forced back onto the front lines, and there was some development in the doctors understanding the condition. But many could not remember what had happened, as if their brains had erased much of the horror that they had in their memories. But there were methods developed in 1917 to reduce the condition, and if someone was shown to have been suffering, then they were given a few days' rest from the front lines. One colonel wrote of this that, "You must send your commotional cases down the line, but when you get these emotional cases, unless they are very bad, if you get hold of your men, and they know, and you know them, and there is a good deal more in the man knowing you than in you knowing the man, you are able to explain to him that there is really nothing wrong with him, give him a rest at the aid spot if necessary, and a day or two's sleep, go with him to the front line, and when there, see him often, sit down beside him and talk to him about the war, and look through his periscope and let the man see you are taking an interest in him. If the symptoms of a soldier continued after being held at a casualty clearing station close to the front line, a soldier may be evacuated further behind lines to be taken to a different centre for evaluation and investigation. However, in 1917, shell shock was banned as a medical diagnosis by the British Army, and they censored explanations of the condition and also mentions of it, so that the true horrors of the conflict were not in fact communicated back home because of the morale at home. As mentioned, some men who were suffering from shell shock were brought to trial for their actions. It was said that they were cowards at times, and they were also accused of military offences such as desertion. During the First World War, the British Army executed over 200 soldiers for military offences, and some of these men, who were shot at dawn and were executed, had been suffering with the condition. Some doctors tried to treat and cure the condition in brutal ways, such as shocking soldiers with high voltage electricity. There was one sufferer who suffered with mutism for 9 months, and he had then been shocked with electricity in his throat, and he also had lit cigarettes placed on his tongue, as well as hot plates placed in his mouth. There were during the conflict 240,000 court-martials, and as mentioned 266 British soldiers were executed for desertion. These men would later gain a posthumous conditional pardon in 2006. Further investigation into the brain tissue of veteran soldiers showed that those who had been exposed to explosives and devices suffered with a number of psychological effects, such as decision-making and memory loss. It was then concluded that shell shock may actually be a physical problem, as it was discovered by analysing brains, and that there was some scarring in certain regions of the brain. There was evidence to suggest that the trenches and the type of warfare was the likely cause of this problem, that the true cause of shell shock was in fact trench warfare, which was established obviously during the First World War. It was written by a war correspondent when analysing those men who had come home with shell shock that something was wrong. They put on civilian clothes again and looked to their mothers and wives very much like the young men who had gone to business in those peaceful days before August 1914. But they had not come back the same men. Something had altered in them. They were subject to sudden moods and tempers, fits of profound depression, alternating with a restless desire for pleasure. Many were easily moved to passion when they lost control of themselves. Many were bitter in their speech, violent in opinion, frightening. Many of those men who went to fight during the First World War were told they were going to fight abroad, and that their experience would be wholly positive, and many joined the fight under the false pretense they were simply going on holiday with their friends. But the true reality of the conflict was the awful environment of the trenches, and many of the men were broken by what they experienced during the war. When they returned home, many suffered heavily, and they were changed forever by what they experienced. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.